Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today. Chapter 1342 War General All of a Sudden. Chapter 1342 War General All of a Sudden. Northern stood at the peak of the tower. Evening had settled across the mountains, though he hadn't noticed its arrival. 3 days had passed while he forged the Syrinx's hunger in the depths of his own soul, and now the blade rested in his grip with a weight that felt both familiar and new. He stared into the distance, but his gaze held no particular target. His eyes were unfocused. His attention was elsewhere. The omnisphere stretched across hundreds of kilometers, and within that vast reach, Northern felt them. Heat signatures, thousands of them, clustered in formations that had been still for hours but were now beginning to shift. He tracked their movement patterns, noting the rhythm, the coordination, the discipline. The Empire believes in its own strength. They'll expect to tear through Ryugen's vanguard and flood the city with sheer numbers. He followed the flow of bodies through his expanded senses. But are they really that predictable? Northern shook his head. The snake who lured the king with honeyed words wouldn't choose the obvious path. This was precisely why he'd positioned the storm bastion here. If he wanted the Ryugen soldiers to follow him without hesitation, to commit to his command without that gnawing doubt that weakened armies from within, then he had to demonstrate exactly what he could do. Words meant nothing while results meant everything. The enemy's strategy assembled itself in his mind like pieces sliding into place. The vanguard assault would serve as a decoy, drawing Ryugen's attention and forces toward the front. Meanwhile, the Empire's true thrust would come from behind, through the monster-infested rear of the mountain range. They'd establish a forward position somewhere in this territory, wait for the second wave against the vanguard to fully commit Ryugen's defenders, then pour through the unguarded back and take the city before anyone realized the danger. They wouldn't expect an easy victory, of course. The monsters alone would require their stronger forces to clear a path. Northern paused, his chain of reasoning still unspooling. He lifted a hand to cover part of his face, trying to hide the fact that he was laughing. Came out as a soft, almost incredulous sound. He was predicting them, and it felt so sweet, like reading a book he'd already finished. His mind had never worked like this before. Strategic thinking, the kind that generals spent decades developing, flowed through him as naturally as breathing. Where had this come from? Through the omnisphere alone. The enemy's intentions seemed transparent. When he layered the Shingen's perception over it, he didn't even need to activate the full technique. The understanding simply existed, as if the knowledge had always been there, waiting for him to notice it. This comes from comprehension itself, he realized. Not power. Understanding. Could it be the books? Did my mind adapt to something? He sighed and lowered his hand, forcing the smile from his face. When exactly will they arrive? He murmured to the empty air. I expected them by now. Revant and the tower, they should have reached him within a day, but something had delayed their approach. His omnisphere couldn't stretch across an entire continent. Not yet, so the specifics remained hidden from him. A pity. The thought carried a note of genuine frustration. If he could extend his perception that far, tracking every relevant movement would become trivial. Of course, monitoring every life across such a distance would be impossible regardless. There were limits even to his growing reach. He sighed again. At the very least, he could sense the tower's presence at the edge of his range. He felt it moving, then stopping. That much awareness came from being the tower master, a connection that existed independent of his other abilities. I hope they're all okay. He trusted that they would be. The people traveling toward him weren't ordinary. Whatever they faced on the road, they were the kind of people destined to stand at humanity's peak. Their current circumstances didn't matter. Their potential did. Northern turned his head toward the western slope of the Tempest Spire. Admiral Yen? Through the omnisphere, he watched the young officer making his way through the forest below. The sky still held traces of gold where the sun sank toward the horizon, but beneath the canopy, darkness had already claimed the mountain. The admiral's surroundings pressed in on him, thick with shadow and menace, and his head snapped from side to side as he searched for threats that seemed to lurk behind every tree. Northern suppressed a laugh. Right? I forgot. He'd woven the abilities of eclipsing dread into the spire's ambient fog without thinking about it. The Supreme Shadow spread its perpetual influence across the entire territory, granting Northern control over every shadow within its reach. But the darkness wasn't merely obedient. It had developed a kind of autonomy, an instinctive intelligence that acted on his behalf without direct command. The fog surrounding the spire had taken on enough presence, enough predatory weight, to drive away monsters. Even the high-ranked ones felt that pressure and chose to hunt elsewhere. Dread manifestation amplified the effect further, pressing fear into the minds of anything that entered the domain. Combined with Eyes of the Shadow for surveillance and Eclipse Step for travel, the entire territory had become an extension of Northern's will. Every kilometer the dark fog touched was reachable in less than a heartbeat. Northern focused on Admiral Yen, tracking the young man's nervous progress through the gloom, and a thought occurred to him. I wonder if I can do that. He activated the ability as the question formed. You're using Eclipse Step, but Northern didn't move. Instead, the shadows beneath Admiral Yen surged upward like a living tide. They swallowed him whole, pulling him down into darkness. And in the same instant, the man erupted from Northern's own shadow at the tower's peak. Admiral Yen stood frozen. His eyes had gone wide and glassy, trembling in their sockets. Sweat beaded across his face and dripped from his jaw. His chest heaved with sharp, shallow breaths, and his hands hung at his sides, fingers twitching as if they wanted to reach for a weapon but couldn't remember how. Northern smiled. It's okay. I called you here. It worked. The Admiral stared at him without comprehension. Several seconds passed before awareness crept back into his expression. He tore his gaze from Northern and looked around the tower, desperately trying to force the fear from his face and failing completely. His head turned toward the forest, toward the path he'd been walking moments ago. He was here. Already here? How? The question hung in his mind like something too heavy to lift. Part of him didn't want the answer. He looked at Northern again, struggling to hide the war between admiration and terror that raged in his chest. Northern's smile hadn't faded. So, Chapter 1343 Imminent Attack. Chapter 1343 Imminent Attack. Admiral Yen was still lost in the strangeness of what had just happened. His body had crossed 500 meters in a single second. He couldn't process it. Couldn't even begin to. He barely managed to raise his head to meet Northern's lingering smile. His speech fell apart on the first try. He paused, forced himself to breathe in, breathe out, and tried again. General Sethran has asked me to tell you that the soldiers have been rounded as you instructed. Right now, in the kingdom, we can account for 7,000 mundane army and 3,000 drifters. Northern considered this for a moment, then focused back on Admiral Yen. And the drifters are mostly populated with what rank? Admiral Yen straightened, his posture becoming crisp and military. We have mostly nomads and drifters. The masters are the knights and commanders of smaller squads, all 100 in total. The drifters number 954, while the nomads are approximately 2,800. Northern touched his jaw, rough with stubble, as he turned the numbers over in his mind. I guess it really is hard for people to become anything more than masters, huh? But the thing was, this reality was difficult to accept. For the most of the past 2 years that he had been a drifter, he wasn't sure how many times he had come across drifters that were lesser than masters. He had met a lot of masters, savants, and sages, too many of them, in fact. It had looked like the world was populated by these caliber of people. However, Northern was also aware that he had to sit back and re-examine everything from a different scope. One that was not that of an almost 15-year-old boy thrust into a gate where he had to survive alone, then emerge into a reality where killing monsters and growing stronger seemed to be the only reasonable thing to do. Not just for him, but for everyone around him. I did hold back on that, though. Northern was not having a good time recollecting the past. It's safe to say he had led a life he wasn't proud of. If it wasn't that his fate was inevitable, he would have long been dead. But then again, the kind of life he led, his stupidity and heart, and bravery at times had led him here. It was inevitable, really. Admiral Yen raised a confused brow as a smug grin crept across Northern's expression. Good stars, who knows what he is imagining? He tried to puzzle it out but had not the faintest idea. Northern collected himself before he could ride that boat for too long. 7,000 mundane army, and 3,000 drifters. He let the numbers sit for a moment. How trained are the mundane men? Admiral Yan's gaze hardened into something serious. The best you can get. I'd say they're as strong as a drifter without talents. Out here, the mountain, the rear zones are great tools for training. Only the toughest ones are out there today. Northern nodded as the Admiral spoke, the man's voice carrying unwavering faith in his fellow soldiers. Not that I expect you to do otherwise. Northern looked beyond the dark fog, into the depth of the forest, and rested against the iron railing of the tower roof where he stood. And does this 10,000 also account for the aerial armada? Admiral Yen paused. He seemed caught, and Northern didn't need to look to know. Northern chuckled. Is General Sethran playing with me? He leaned away from the railing. Your country is to face a leviathan of a country, and you're not going to account for your strongest armed forces? Admiral Yen lowered his head, unable to speak. Northern finally turned to him. What did he say? Admiral Yen hesitantly raised his head, peeking at Northern's face. He said it should be enough for someone of your caliber? Northern chuckled. These bastards. What was he to do? Humans would be humans nonetheless. The aerial force was Ryugen's specialty and their strongest arm of assault. It was also their most precious. Because Northern had read so much in the library, he knew what the aerial forces meant to Ryugen and why they always had more drifters awakened talents that associated with aerial battles. He had at least expected some level of transparency, even if they were not going to relegate that part of the army to him. I guess he still has some doubts about me. Northern clicked his tongue. It may be doubt, or it may be the old man refusing to give away the one thing that upheld his prowess and importance. He shook his head. This is why I hate old men. Serious situation like this, and that's all he's thinking about. Northern, however, stretched. Yawned. He kept looking beyond the fog and the forest, which drew Admiral Yan's attention. The Admiral had grown quite fond of studying Northern's gaze and body movement, hoping to learn anything that might change his fate for a lifetime. What do you think we should do, Admiral Yen? An attack is imminent tonight. The Admiral froze in place. His eyes couldn't stay still. Huh. Northern turned to him with a small smile. His expression was far too casual. Oh, I meant, you guys don't know, but I can see them coming from hundreds of kilometers away. Besides, they're using a stealth technique to move forward. Northern paused for a moment and continued thoughtfully. Though something of that scale, I'm curious whose talent ability is working it out. Or is it an item? Moving over 10,000 men with stealth is really something. He focused on Admiral Yen again. Anyways, yes, your surveillance probably missed it because of that. So what do you think we should do? How should we protect ourselves against this attack? Chapter 1344, The Silver Lining. Admiral Yen stood there for a few seconds, not saying anything. It wasn't that the experienced war master had no answer for Northern, but rather that Northern's tone in dropping this revelation had caused him to doubt his own response. The levity of the matter, the way Northern conveyed it to him, made him worry and stiff with confusion. Even though there was an answer forming in his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was utterly wrong, such that he had to carefully lean forward and ask, Lord Northern, are we in danger? Northern turned to the Admiral, utterly lost and confused. He turned to the distance, where the fog disappeared into the forest, and turned back to Admiral Yen. Then he grinned. What? No, not at all. We are not in danger at all. Goodness. I like your spirit. He clapped once, the sound sharp in the fog. We are not in danger. They are the ones in danger. Northern said this energetically. He was suddenly in a good mood thanks to Admiral Yan's response. He had been trying so hard to get a bunch of people to see him and believe in him, and finally here was one person who finally saw eye to eye with him. It felt golden. But before Northern could bask more in his euphoria, the young man said again, cautiously, So, they are here? Does that mean they're here? You weren't speaking hypothetically? Northern paused. A mild displeasure crossed his face. Why would I? Admiral Yen found no words for retort. He hesitated and stuttered. It's just that. This is the opening salvo of a battle that could very well determine the fate of an entire country. And you break the news like you're talking about your love life? Northern's confusion grew, and it reflected plainly on his face. Love life? I've never had an active love life. I am really confused about the source of your misconception, Admiral Yen. Admiral Yen looked even more confused. He breathed in and out, pressing 2 fingers to his forehead. Are we getting attacked? Northern nodded. I believe I made that clear enough. Admiral Yen felt like he wanted to pull out his own hair. His hands actually twitched toward his scalp before he stopped himself. That's the thing. You didn't. The man let out with a frustrated tone. Northern, meanwhile, shrugged. Not my fault, really. I think I'm used to things like this happening, so I wasn't just surprised. Aside from that, I've been surveying them for a couple of days, and they really are a small number. Not an issue. He tilted his head. Why do you look so shaken? Admiral Yen continued to stare at Northern. I'm not sure this man understands at all. Northern turned away from him and replaced the confusion with a casual smile. Then his expression shifted. Serious now. But you are yet to answer my question, Admiral Yen. Admiral Yen felt like he was yanked to life by the intensity of Northern's voice. He looked forward, toward where Northern was currently looking. He wasn't sure why the young man was so glued to the forest beyond the dark fog. All he could see was darkness. His face straightened. His dark eyes grew even darker. If the Empire has mobilized their troops, then we are expecting an imminent attack on our vanguard. The Empire is pompous. They're powerful, and it's quite obvious. Against a small nation like us, they will use us as an example. They will end it swiftly and as boldly as they can. I think they'll simply come in through our front door and break through with overwhelming force and numbers. Northern noted the man's words. He's not dull. The Admiral's voice grew colder. The best way to defend ourselves is to make their advance easy. Northern's expression was blank. The man continued. We can focus our war machinations and men in resistance. But the resistance is not to the end that we defend our gate. It is to the end that we make sure they break it. However, not without getting tired. Northern looked at the man. A small light finally found his eyes. You want them to retreat? Admiral Yen nodded. Yes. They'll be retreating not out of loss but fatigue. But the Empire has surplus men to waste. Would there be a benefit to them retreating when they can simply send in more troops less than an hour later? The Admiral regarded Northern's eyes and nodded with a smile. You're right, Lord Northern. That's the point of the resistance. The whole point is to make the Empire think they've already broken down our gate. Then we bring the real fight inside the city. We know the mountain far better than them. We can use that against them. Northern appreciated the idea that the Admiral was sharing. But it's old. The Empire knows this. It's how Ryugen fought them in the past, a reason for many of their undecided battles against Ryugen. The Realmguard Empire had maintained several decades of peace and inactivity. Between the years from their back and forth with Ryugen and now they'd grown immensely. Northern shook his head. Such a plan is suicide, Admiral Yen. Not only are you underestimating the Empire, you're overestimating yourselves. You think because of things like training and landscape you can turn the tides on people who pride themselves in being the beacon of power. Northern allowed a thoughtful pause, then shrugged. Or maybe I'm simply giving the Empire too much credit. But that is your plan, and I don't see it ending in victory. You and your kingdom will be slaughtered. Like insects. Admiral Yen still had that strong look in his eyes. Like dark amusement. But there's a silver lining, isn't there? Northern raised his brows. Please, amuse me. The Admiral smiled darker. We have you. The Empire doesn't. Northern blinked at him for a moment. Then he let out a big laugh. Chapter 1345 Opening Salvo. Toward the lower slopes of the mountain, a massive wall rose where metal fused with blue gemstone, the barrier climbing from the rock as though it had grown there rather than been built. The gate looked like an extension of the mountain itself, not something imposed upon it. The Raganas had created something astonishing. A structure towering over 50 meters, its shadow stretching long across the vast forest that carpeted the slopes below. The sun had set hours ago. 2 moons hung in its place, pale and distant, their light barely cutting through the darkness. The real illumination came from the gate itself. Runic patterns carved into the metal and gem pulsed with faint blue light, casting their glow far into the night, reaching into the treeline below. The patterns were not decoration. They were purpose. The season of snow was ending. Tonight, unlike every night for the past months, the air held less bite and less white drifted from the sky. The forest canopy below shifted with the wind, branches swaying against one another in constant, restless motion, as though the trees themselves could sense something the sentries could not. From the massive stone outcroppings that flanked the gate, surveillance towers rose toward the sky, their heights climbing well above the treeline. Each tower commanded vast sight lines, able to see deep into the forest and far across the approaches behind the wall. Cones of blue light rotated in slow circles, sweeping across the trees in methodical patterns. The surveillance lights were triggered by unregistered movement within 100 feet. Additional towers stood at the northern and western reaches of the mountain base, positioned for overlapping coverage. 6 towers in total. All of them defense positions. All of them active. All of them waiting for an attack. If something was coming, they would have detected it hours ago. Or so they believed. The peace of the night continued undisturbed. Soldiers stationed atop the towers had begun dozing at their posts, lulled by the quiet and the cold. For an opening salvo, tonight seemed disappointingly calm. Then the light screamed. Blue became red. The surveillance beams spun 10 times faster than before, whipping across the forest in frantic arcs. Before the soldiers could rise from their posts, before hands could reach the ballistas, a sound split the night. A massive tearing whistle, cold and fast, cutting through the air like the breath of something enormous. Then impact. The mountain base shook so hard that men stumbled on their platforms. A giant javelin had struck the gate, red lightning dancing and crackling across its black metal body. The structure held, but the tremor ran through stone and metal alike, rattling teeth and making the towers sway. Soldiers paled. Their shouts erupted across the defensive line. "We're under attack! We're under attack!" The Empires. Despite the shock, training took hold. They scrambled to their ballistas, all 6 towers swinging their weapons toward the forest. Massive bolts locked into position. Essence began flooding into the mechanisms. For several long heartbeats, they found nothing. The Trillion was dark and empty. No formations advanced through the trees. No siege engines rolled forward. No massed ranks of soldiers or beasts. The forest offered nothing to aim at, nothing to target, nothing to destroy. Confusion rippled through the towers. Where was the enemy? Where had the javelin come from? The blue lights had barely flickered back to normal when they screamed again. Red beams. Spinning wildly. The alarm shrieked across the mountain base. Before anyone could process the warning, another black rod whistled through the night, its speed like a meteor falling from the heavens. It struck the gate with a thunderous crash, and the entire mountain base trembled a second time. Dust shook loose from the stone. The towers swayed again. The master in charge of the tower squad did not wait for his men. He climbed to the right-wing platform, shoved the soldier there aside, and took the ballista himself. Captain Danma narrowed his brown eyes against the wind. His gray hair fluttered across his weathered face, but his expression remained locked, focused, calculating. His gaze cut through the darkness toward the forest below. He poured his soul essence into the weapon. Normally, the crew would load a physical bolt into the groove. This ballista was different. It had been crafted from Ethereum and built in collaboration with the Kingdom of Sussex, incorporating their unique ironwood and runic spellwork. It did not require ammunition. Another javelin screamed through the air and struck the gate. The tower shuddered beneath his feet, stone groaning against the impact. Captain Danma did not flinch. At the center groove of the ballista, a blue arrow materialized from nothing, shimmering with essence as it solidified into a bolt of fearsome size and density. The light of it reflected in Captain Danma's eyes. He shifted the weapon fractionally to the right, his brown eyes glowing faint with concentration as he calculated the angle. He released the trigger. The bolt exploded from the right-wing tower with a sound like thunder cracking. Less than a heartbeat later, it collided with the forest. What followed was devastation. Everything within a 400-foot radius vanished into blue fire. The explosive force ripped tree trunks to splinters in an instant, uprooted entire groves, and sent the shattered remains cartwheeling through the surrounding forest. The annihilating shockwave expanded outward, raising everything in its path, flattening brush and breaking branches half a mile from the impact point. Blue flames licked at the destruction, consuming what remained. The other soldiers witnessed the strike. They screamed with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "Captain Danma! Captain Danma! Aim to the forest!" The command echoed across the towers. Ballistas swung into position across all remaining platforms, essence flooding their mechanisms. As soldiers prepared to fire, Captain Danma straightened from the ballista. His weathered face showed no satisfaction, only cold calculation. "If we don't know their location, destroy the entire forest." The soldier behind him nodded quickly, his face pale but determined. "Yes, sir." He saluted sharply. As Captain Danma stepped back, the man assumed position and began charging the ballista with his own essence. But while he poured power into the weapon, while blue light gathered in the groove, another javelin whistled through the air. This one did not aim for the gate. It struck the stone pillar that held the tower aloft. The pillar exploded in a spray of shattered rock and twisted metal. The tower tilted, groaned, crumbled. Captain Danma went down with it, the platform collapsing beneath him as the entire structure folded toward the earth. The strike had been so brutally fast that the detection alarm only screamed after the stones were already falling. Debris slammed into the mountain base, scattering rubble across the approach, the crash of collapsing masonry echoing across the defensive line. The tower was gone in seconds. Nothing but ruin remained where it had stood. Soldiers in the remaining towers stared in horror. That was their captain's tower. The enemy had targeted it specifically, had waited for him to reveal himself, and had brought it down with a single devastating strike. The tower had been reinforced. Ethereum ran through the stone pillar, strengthening it against assault. It was supposed to hold against siege weapons, against magical bombardment, against anything short of a sustained assault. One javelin had been enough. Shaken as they were, the remaining soldiers did not freeze. More blue bolts launched from the surviving towers, streaking toward the forest, exploding different sections of the Trillion. Fire and concussive force tore through the trees, leaving craters and burning wreckage in their wake. The night lit up with destruction. It did not stop the next javelin. Black metal whistled through the wind, cold and certain. It struck the left-wing tower. Chapter 1346 The Wrong Evil. Northern stood at the tower's edge, watching over the dark fog, unbothered as subtle tremors traveled across the tempest's spire. Why would he care? Wasn't like the shockwaves from kilometers away would affect his tower. Even if they could, this was the tempest's spire. He shook slightly. Not from the tremors. Damn it. I'm getting quite impatient. He spoke aloud to himself, the words swallowed by the wind. Should I just meet them halfway? His hands found the railing, knuckles whitening as he gripped. Self-control, self-control, self-control. The mantra felt hollow. When had controlling himself become the only challenge left? He paused, gaze drifting out of focus. My birthday is tomorrow? Northern counted backward and discovered that, yes, he was going to be 17 tomorrow. The realization settled over him like fog. Am I going to spend my birthday fighting? He seemed shaken for a moment, but then a grin slowly split his mouth. The expression looked almost feral against the dark sky. I'm going to spend my birthday fighting. His voice carried a strange eagerness now. I hope there are a lot of good and worthy fighters among them. Hand-to-hand combatants, unique heritages and battle styles. I wish to grow my library of knowledge. He tilted his head, considering. I should try not to kill them too early, so I can get enough time to enjoy myself. Northern paused and wondered if that was even possible. How much would he have to hold back his strength in order to not kill them with a single punch? And if he had to hold back, how was he supposed to enjoy himself? I did enjoy myself with that man, though. Duke Amin had managed to amuse him, even if only for a few seconds before slipping through his fingers right when the enjoyment started. Like trying to savor a meal that dissolved on his tongue. Northern lowered his head. Is this what they mean by lonely at the top? The thought tasted bitter. He'd heard the phrase before and dismissed it as melodrama. Rich people complaining about their problems. But standing here, 17 tomorrow, with an army marching toward him and no one capable of making the fight interesting, he leaned against the railing and let out a breath. I wish everyone could just be strong already. The words disappeared into the fog. No one answered. No one ever did. While Northern spoke, the ground floor door that led to the roof opened. Footsteps climbed the stairs. He didn't need to turn back to know who it was. He'd sensed the person coming all along. Sale emerged onto the roof, donning white and dull gold armor. The armor was linen for the most part, that white material almost overflowing around his body, with dull gold metal adorning his forehead, shoulders, ankles, gauntlets, waist, and knee boots. He looked like something between a warrior and a priest. I'm ready, Sale said. Me too. Northern turned. Judgment had arrived behind Sale, wearing a golden sleeveless metal chest plate and a flared skirt that barely reached her mid-thigh. Her round shield had collapsed into her gauntlet, compact and ready. He'd known Sale was coming, so that arrival hadn't surprised him. But Judgment? I haven't given you any permission of that manner. Northern's voice carried an edge. He turned to Sale, expectant. I tried to talk her out of it. The Arrow Sage's tone fell slightly, weighted with resignation. She wouldn't listen to me. Why would I? Judgment raised her voice, chin lifting. I listened to no one. Not even you. Northern considered, for a few moments, whether he should teach her a lesson or two right here. But he knew it wasn't that she didn't recognize his authority. Judgment was simply a very spoiled brat who had never learned the weight of the word no. That old lady. Why do I feel like she just stylishly dumped her mistake on me? Judgment spoke again before he could respond. Didn't Anike say she wanted me to gain experience? What better way to gain experience than this? She gestured toward the fog below, where an army waited. Her eyes sparkled. Northern frowned slightly. Isn't peace and nonviolence a nature of the Velithian tribesmen? Judgment's expression went flat for a moment. Blank, controlled. Then a twisted grin climbed her features, and something in her eyes shifted. Well, isn't that a surprise? Northern frowned deeper, suspicion crawling up his spine. What is? I love violence. The words burst out of her like water through a cracked dam. Don't tell me you never knew. I just love beating the shit out of people. Fuck humans, for fuck's sake, they're so annoying. They need to be slit in the throat a few times. Her grin widened, teeth showing. Or better still, gouge out their eyes and force them down their throats. I wonder if having them eat their own brains will make them have more sense. Northern stepped back. It wasn't just him. Even Sale looked at her like he was witnessing something deeply wrong. Something that shouldn't exist in the shape of a girl with sparkling eyes and a pretty smile. Northern was just now understanding that he was nothing close when it came to hating and cursing. Judgment had elevated it to an art form. A disturbing, stomach-turning art form. I feel like she shouldn't be let out. Judgment's expression shifted again. The bloodlust vanished like it had never existed. She wore a faint, pleasant smile and bowed 90 degrees at Northern. The picture of demure respect. Please, sir. Let me release a bit of my frustration. She raised her head, eyes wide and innocent, as if she hadn't just described force-feeding people their own organs. Northern sighed. The concern on his face was evident, and he made no effort to hide it. You lot are taught to only defend. Your city is what fights back for you. Can you even attack properly? Attacking is. He stopped as he saw a malicious smirk had crept across Judgment's face. He hesitated. What did you do? Judgment stood proud, shoulders back, chin raised. It's very simple if you've been learning the same technique for 15 years. All I had to do was add a little here and there. I figured out the attack pattern to our battle style a long time ago. She looked up thoughtfully, as if recalling a fond memory. Actually, I think it was already complete. Our ancestors merely removed the assault part and passed down the defense part. Because when I discovered it, it felt like piecing together a puzzle. The Velithian battle style felt complete to me. Northern shook his head slowly. Anike, I don't think Velithia is going to have a peaceful reign after yours. The girl was still standing there, eagerly waiting for his response. Her eyes sparkled cutely, as if she wasn't waiting for approval to go slaughter thousands of people. The dissonance made his skin crawl. Scratching his head, Northern let out a frustrated groan. I will keep an eye on her and make sure she comes to no harm. Sale's voice was steady, resigned, but steady. Northern looked at him. Of course you will. Her safety was not the problem. At least it wasn't Northern's problem, right? Now, what bothered him was whether it was acceptable for him to allow her to display a side of herself that was completely opposite of what her tribe stood for. To let her paint herself in blood while wearing their name. At last, Northern sighed. I don't know. I hope Anike doesn't hate me for this. He looked at both of them, then settled his gaze on Judgment in particular. Fine. You can go. His voice carried weight, a formal pronouncement. But this is all on you. Whatever happens from here, all of it falls on you. Judgment tilted her head back slightly, a coy gesture that didn't match the hunger in her eyes. What? Hell no. You're supposed to be my guardian. Remember? She grinned, wide and genuine this time. But thank you. She jumped eagerly, like a child promised a trip to their favorite place. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. Northern turned to Sale, deliberately looking away from Judgment's enthusiasm. As for you, I have something for you. Northern extended his hand forward. Something materialized into his palm. From the depth of his soul, drawn from that inner place where his most valuable possessions resided. Chapter 1347 Tide Turner. Chapter 1347 Tide Turner. The weapon curled out of the darkness like ink stirred through water. Northern watched Sale's face as the bow materialized fully, coiling into itself before settling into shape. Its limbs were not carved wood or shaped metal but living architecture. 8 sinuous tentacle forms of deep navy and gunmetal blue, intertwining and spiraling around each other like frozen currents caught mid-dance. Each tendril gleamed with an oily iridescence, shifting between midnight and burnished silver depending on how the light caught it. The central grip featured a diamond-shaped eye motif carved from polished Kirathon cartilage, housing a pale, milky lens that seemed to watch, an unsettling remnant of the apex maelstrom's gaze, repurposed into something new. But the most striking feature was the triple bowstrings, woven from bioluminescent jellyfish nerves. They glowed with a soft, ethereal blue light and were connected at intervals by small crystallized nodes, hardened venom drops that acted as essence conduits. Northern knew that when an arrow was nocked, those nodes would flare in sequence like a countdown. The tentacle limbs curled into elegant spirals at each tip, giving the weapon an almost ceremonial appearance. Beautiful enough to display, deadly enough to end wars. Northern had always harbored ambitions of becoming a forger, which meant he'd never neglected the importance of materials. When he'd lost access to his soul plane, he'd feared all the carcasses his soul summons had gathered at the Academy dungeon would be gone forever. But when he'd finally regained it, most of them had remained intact. Waiting for him, this bow was what that patience had purchased. He handed it to Sale before he could second-guess himself. Here. His voice came out more casual than he felt. I made this in a hurry. Check it out and tell me what you think. As Sale received the bow, something shifted in the archer's expression. A subtle widening of the eyes, a catch in his breath. Northern recognized the signs. The man had heard the system voice. The item had registered. An item? Sale's voice cracked slightly. You can create an item? Northern smiled, though the expression felt fragile on his face. I'm glad it worked. Have you checked it? He almost sounded anxious. He was anxious. Is this how cooks feel? The thought surfaced unbidden. It was hard to suppress the worry that came with waiting to see if something you'd created would satisfy. Would it meet expectations? Would it disappoint? A veteran cook might have overcome such anxiety through years of consistent praise, the accumulated confidence of countless successful meals. Their skill had been tested so many times that doubt no longer had purchase. I'm not a veteran forger. I've barely been one for 6 months. It was easy to forget, even for Northern himself, that he'd only learned blacksmithing recently, that he dreamt about creating an item a mere 4 months ago, treating it as some distant ambition rather than an imminent reality. And yet here he was, watching Sale's face for judgment. The Arrow Sage's expression kept shifting, widening, cycling through emotions Northern couldn't quite parse. Was that amazement? Disappointment? The longer it went on, the more Northern's stomach tightened. There's no way he'll be disappointed, right? Sale finally looked up from the bow, meeting Northern's eyes. He shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice threatened to break. I can't accept this. Northern frowned. Why? It's not perfect. Sale stepped back, staring at him with naked incredulity. Not perfect. His expression shifted into something almost reproachful. Lord Northern, this is the most terrifying, most amazing item I have ever laid eyes on in all my years as a drifter. His voice rose. How did you even make this? The question tumbled out before Sale could stop himself. And then more followed, the words coming faster, breathless with disbelief. The arrows can ignite explosions or flash freeze targets. I can choose the void option that creates a dead zone, suppressing healing and weakening magical defense, and the radiant surge ability. He trailed off, shaking his head. It complements my talent so well. The bow itself complements my talent so well. I can increase the size of my arrow tenfold and magnify its impact in the same manner, as far as my essence can afford. Sale paused, almost choking on his own excitement. His face had shifted into an expression Northern had never expected to see from someone of his caliber. Not in the short time they'd known each other. Northern felt something loosen in his chest. The smile that spread across his face was genuine now. Essentially, it has 3 active abilities and 4 passive abilities, making it an Order 7 item. His smile darkened with satisfaction. I tried to push it past 7 orders, but that proved practically impossible through normal means. So I found another way. Sale's eyes narrowed slightly. He inspected the bow again, a faint suspicion forming. Do you see the weapon trait? Northern continued. It functions like another ability. I just sneaked it in there to deceive the universal system all created. He couldn't quite keep the pride from his voice. Once a day, if you hit a target and it survives, it becomes marked. You can track their location regardless of where they are. Even stealth won't save them. Sale checked the bow's information again, confirming what Northern had described. When he looked up, he shook his head in fresh disbelief. No, I really can't accept this. His voice had grown strained. It's too much. A heroic item of this caliber. How can I possibly? Just take it. Northern exhaled, letting some of the tension drain from his shoulders. It's probably the most inferior thing I'm ever going to create anyway. I made it because I promised you something along those lines. He shrugged. And it was truly no loss. I gained experience from the process. Thanks to you, I was able to study the form of a bow and learn to craft one properly. Consider this repayment for help you had no idea you provided. Sale stared down at the weapon in his hands. His eyes still struggled to accept what they were seeing. Then quietly he spoke its name. Tide Turner. Northern nodded, satisfaction settling into his bones. He turned toward the distant gate, visible only as a suggestion of light through the trees. Do you want to try firing it? Sale blinked at him. To where? The gate, of course. Northern's tone was casual, but the weight behind his words was not. You'll be joining the battle there. I want you to turn the tide of whatever fight you enter, starting from this one. Sale's expression flickered with concern. Won't I hit allies? Hell no. Northern shook his head. The passive effect, Kirathon's focus, helps you lock in. Your vision can cut through distance and reach the target directly. Should cover about 1 kilometer. And you have other abilities to complement it, along with your own talent abilities. He raised an eyebrow. Don't you have a homing ability? Sale nodded, hesitating only slightly. I do. Then what are you scared of? Northern jerked his chin toward the forest. Come on. Fire the damn thing. He turned toward the western tree line, toward the distant gate. Meanwhile, Judgment stood off to the side, watching the entire exchange with an expression of puzzled amusement. Sale exhaled. He drew both strings of the bow simultaneously, and a glowing light began to swirl and coalesce at the knock, spiraling around the central eye. His own eyes blazed with sudden light. Distance collapsed before him. Across the vast stretch of forest, he could see them clearly now. Figures in black and red armor, covered by a strange, almost invisible aegis. Two of them held a gigantic siege bow between them, and a third stood at its center, knocking a black rod twice his own height onto the string. Despite the weapon's enormous size, he drew it back with terrible strength. A cold, delirious smile spread across Sale's face. He pulled Tideturner's string taut, and released. The arrow of light sang. It tore across the mountainside with a speed that ripped the air apart, trailing terrible torrents of wind in its wake. Sale staggered back from the shockwave that exploded from his grip, his feet sliding against the ground. For a moment his eyes stayed wide. He had never felt so much power from simply shooting an arrow. The recoil alone had nearly knocked him off his feet, and the projectile had crossed a distance that should have taken seconds in what felt like a heartbeat. This bow was a tyrannical creation. It was magnificent. Chapter 1348 Tideturner. Chapter 1348 Tideturner. At the gate, the towers suffered devastating damage with no way of knowing what was attacking them. Stone dust hung in the air where ramparts had collapsed. Bodies lay in the rubble, unmoving. The Ryugana soldiers fired essence ballista into the forest, burning and raising swathes of it in an instant. The treeline blazed now, flames roaring through the canopy, casting writhing orange light across the mountainside. And yet it was not enough. Javelins kept flying out of the burning forest, trailing darkness behind them like wounds in the air. Whatever was firing them remained untouched by the explosions and the inferno consuming everything around them. The projectiles flew with terrible speed, striking the bastioned gate of the kingdom. All four towers had been crushed to rubble, their defensive enchantments flickering and dying in the wreckage. From the battlements of the wall that coiled around the mountain like a stone serpent merged with the peak itself, torrents of arrows exploded into the dark sky and rained down on the forest. Some detonated on impact, throwing gouts of flame into the air. Others pierced straight through the canopy, expecting to destroy concentrations of enemy forces beneath. But the unending flow of black javelins made the Ryugana soldiers' efforts look futile. Nothing they did stopped the advancement. Nothing even slowed it. The gate was quaking with each impact, groaning under the assault. But there was nothing to worry about. Not yet. As javelins slammed against the towering gate and rattled it, curls of blue lightning discharged in shockwaves and the damage restored itself almost immediately. Cracks sealed and dents smoothed. The whips of lightning released from the massive metal fortress made a portion of the mountain tremble with each pulse, stone grinding against stone deep within. It looked like a stalemate. It wasn't. The Ryugana soldiers had no idea how much damage their enemies had taken, how much force their enemies possessed. The fact that they couldn't even see who they were fighting gnawed at them. Men shifted their weight on the battlements. Hands tightened on weapons until knuckles went white. Eyes darted toward shadows that held nothing, searching for targets that refused to exist. Fear is an instrument. It births irrational patterns. And their enemy would be waiting to exploit every one of them. Another captain of the defense force stood on the rampart before a stereoscope, peering through the enchanted lenses to gauge the distance to their enemy. Nothing, not a single target. Just burning trees and smoke. He stepped back and tightened his jaw with frustration. Yet even as he pulled away from the stereoscope, another black javelin tore out of the forest, trailing that same unnatural darkness. Targeting the point of origin, a barrage of massive arrows flew toward it and bombarded the treeline. Explosions bloomed through the burning forest. But there was no reaction, no devastation beyond what they had already caused. No screams too. They had repeated this pattern again and again, firing at the source of each javelin the moment it appeared. Their enemies were either dying in absolute silence or not being hit at all. Just as the soldiers concluded a round of firing and began loading for the next, a savage torrent of black javelins exploded into the air, tearing out of the forest and curving to descend on the gates. Dozens of them, perhaps 100. The captain's face went pale. It wasn't the numbers that scared him. Barely more than 100 projectiles. But each one carried devastating power, and the cumulative damage to the gate had stopped being negligible chapters ago. Now they intended to destroy the walls too, like they were running out of patience. In that moment, something strange happened. As the javelins descended, a trail of light from the northwestern angle of the mountain curled through the sky with blinding speed. It moved like a star given purpose, leaving a searing afterimage across the darkness. They all saw it for a heartbeat before it streaked across the sky and detonated the falling javelins in a single catastrophic flash. The explosion turned the entire mountain white. The land shook as if trying to tear itself apart. The shockwave hit the battlements and staggered soldiers backward, those too close to the edge grabbing desperately for handholds. Trees melted in the heat. Flames that had been burning through the forest simply ceased to exist, consumed by something hotter. Heat scars seared into the ground in radiating patterns. The earth shifted from brown to black to scorched red in layers. Then the explosion rumbled backward, a wall of force and fire upheaving and raising everything that remained of the forest with implacable hunger. The soldiers on the battlement were blinded for a long second, hands raised against the light, comprehension failing them entirely. When the brilliance dimmed and their vision slowly returned, their eyes widened at the landscape that lay bare before them. The forest was gone. The entire forest that had spread across the western base of the mountain and transitioned into the stony plains leading to the clustered cliff had vanished. Only burned ground remained, stretching to the horizon, emitting thick wisps of smoke that rose into the night sky like the breath of something dying. And yet, somehow, a portion of the land was unscathed. The trees that had covered it were gone, torn from the earth and reduced to ash drifting on the wind. But the ground beneath remained untouched, unmarked by the devastation surrounding it. The captain leaned forward. He grabbed the stereoscope quickly and positioned it to that direction. There, a large, almost invisible dome spreading across the distant landscape. No one would have known it existed if not for the way it flickered, phasing in and out of visibility. Each blink revealed a cluster of shapes within, coloring that section of terrain differently before vanishing again into transparency. Then the dome collapsed entirely, whatever power sustaining it finally spent. The clusters were revealed. The distance was staggering, far over 100 kilometers. This was roughly 300 kilometers from the wall. A march of 10 to 12 days for ordinary men crossing that terrain. 5 days at a hard run for trained soldiers pushing themselves to exhaustion. They had been attacking from 300 kilometers away. It was inconceivable. They had stood at that impossible distance and struck the gate, struck the towers with accuracy and force that should not have been possible. The stereoscopes could barely see that far. The Essence ballista couldn't reach a fraction of that range. The captain stared into the distance, shock carved into his face. They all knew the Empire fielded soldiers of terrifying power, warriors who treated the impossible as routine. But this set a new standard entirely. This rewrote what possibility meant. Chapter 1349 Into the War. Chapter 1349 Into the War. Sale still stared at the tide turner in his hand with absolute astonishment. The weight of it felt right. Perfect. This was going to be an heirloom, undoubtedly. Something he could pass down through his family line if he ever had one. Smiling in fulfillment, he held the bow tightly and returned his gaze to Northern. Lord Northern, if it's okay, I'd like to join the battle now. Northern nodded. Sure. But then he paused. Sale waited, watching as something passed behind Northern's eyes. Then Northern extended his hand downward and a pool of darkness formed beneath his palm, revealing a gateway that swirled like a whirlpool caught in a blue sea. 2 creatures pulled themselves out of the portal, first vague with shadow, their forms bleeding darkness, then clarifying as they touched solid ground. The first was a sleek white dragon with an aerodynamic build designed for speed. Pale ivory scales shimmered with a faint opalescent sheen, while its underbelly and tail faded to dark charcoal. Golden horns crowned its head, matching the metallic gold talons that gleamed like polished bronze. Even standing still, it looked fast, built to cut through air like a blade through water. The other was its dark counterpart. Deep purple-black scales that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Massive bat-like wings with translucent violet membranes that glowed faintly at the edges. Crimson claws and horn tips pulsed with dim inner light. It was sleeker than its cousin and more serpentine. Where the white one promised speed, this one promised stealth and dread. Aoi had called the first one Radiant Seraph, and the tenebrous one Nightmare Wyvern. These 2 were the evolutions that came from the variants of Aerosiles created by both infinite iteration and recursive generation, both abilities of Endless. Northern felt more drawn to the darker one. But he wasn't ready for his own mount yet. He had thought about it, though. He wanted his own ride to be 10 times larger than these. These ones were merely the size of a small aircraft's wingspan, around 8 meters from tip to tip. The Nightmare Wyvern was about a meter smaller than the Radiant Seraph. Northern wanted whatever he would call his mount to dwarf a standard airplane back on Earth. I wonder how many of them I have to fuse together to get that. It was going to take time. One thing Northern knew was that recursive generation worked with time. He could vaguely sense it was nearing time for the ability to create another evolution, since its deep analysis and understanding of this one was slowly reaching the brim. It was going to take time. One thing Northern knew was that recursive generation worked with time. So far there had been only one generation of the variants created by Endless. He could vaguely sense it was nearing time for the ability to create another evolution, since its deep analysis and understanding of this one was slowly reaching the brim. Both creatures settled on the spire roof, their talons clicking against the stone. Judgment looked at the radiant seraph with stars of light practically exploding from her eyes. Belatedly remembering her tendency, Northern extended his hand, stopping her as she approached the small white dragon. "Wait, you don't need this. You can already fly, can't you?" Judgment glanced between his face and the deathly beautiful creature. Her expression said everything. Logic was not going to win this argument. "This is different. I can also manage my essence well and focus fully on attack. Besides, I'm not that fast, I promise. It's all pointless." "Okay, I still want to ride." "Then take the black one." Judgment rebelled immediately. "What? No. Hell no. That thing looks carved from darkness. This one on the other hand." She turned her head to the radiant seraph, her eyes glittering with light. Northern found himself caught in a small dilemma. He had wanted to give Sail the radiant seraph to match the archer's elegance, and here Judgment was ruining it all. "It's okay, Lord Northern," Sail said, a kind smile on his face. He looked at the bow in his hand. His grip tightened on it, almost unconsciously. "I can't thank you enough for this. I really love it, and then you're helping me with a flying mount." "Lord Northern." Sail looked like he wanted to ask a question, but stopped himself. Instead he smiled. "Thank you so much for this. I won't fall short of your expectations for me." Northern folded his arms. "Frankly speaking, I have no expectations." He paused, then added, "Even if I did, I don't think you would." He smiled one last time. "Go get them." Saddles manifested out of the shadows and solidified on the bodies of both echoes. Sail mounted the nightmare wyvern with practiced grace. Judgment practically threw herself onto the radiant seraph. Both bestial echoes flapped their wings against the wind and launched with a force that threw them straight into the sky. Northern's hair and clothes whipped violently for a moment before the two riders vanished into the distance. Less than a second and they were gone. Silence settled over the spire roof. Then he turned back to the edge of the forest where the fog had disappeared. He locked his fingers together, cracking his knuckles as he stretched his hands forward. Used the opportunity to roll his shoulders. "Just how many times have I stretched today? My body must really be anticipating." His gaze fell on the dark horizon. A chilling focus settled over his eyes. Then he opened his hands. A swirling mass of darkness fumed out of his palm and continued to expand. It grew and coalesced, solidifying into a long rod sharp on both ends. The rod itself stood twice Northern's height. This was a manifestation of supreme shadow, which Northern had tried to make as physical as possible. He wrapped it with dread manifestation. And then he did something he hadn't quite done before. He lunged his arm back with explosive force, causing the wind around the area to whip violently and displace. Then he released the rod, throwing it forward with even more devastating force. But when the shadow rod left his hand, Northern used eclipse step and entered into the rod itself, riding with it at hysterical speed. The shadow rod trailed across the air, crossing the dark fog and a large portion of the forest in a heartbeat, falling toward a specific region within the dark forest. Encased within his autonomous shadow, Northern was already smiling. This will be fun. Chapter 1350 The Only Hope. The invisibility dome that had been helping the Empire's army stealthily approach Ryugen's gate was gone. But that did not help the situation as anyone would have thought it would. Instead, it only made matters worse. There was no weapon in their arsenal, no machination or siege engine, that could breach the vast distance between them and the Empire's army. The Empire's cover had been blown, and still there was nothing Ryugen could do to fight back. They knew it. The Empire knew it too. The captain leaned on the parapet, looking at that impossible distance with pain in his eyes. His knuckles had gone pallid against the stone. Meanwhile, far away, two men knelt and held a gigantic bow between them, while a third carried a javelin taller than himself. He was already knocking it to the bowstring, pulling it back with his entire body. There were rows of soldiers like this, all of them filling the Empire's front line in groups of 3. 2 kneeling and bracing the weight of each massive bow while the third lifted a javelin arrow, knocked it, and pulled back with terrific strength until the rope of the bow had gone so taut it looked like it might snap. Then they released. With explosive force, the javelins went flying, covering hundreds of meters in less than a moment while whistling across the air like the cries of dying birds. At long last they arrived at Ryugen's airspace and bombarded their walls and gates, releasing a thundercrack sound that traveled across the sky and quaked the wind itself. Ryugen was completely helpless before their enemy. What kind of weapon do they have? What manner of men are these people? This should be impossible. Ryugen had centuries of compiled experience facing the Empire. When soldiers enrolled in the army, the first thing they were taught was how to fight a Reamguardian soldier. The kingdom had always been confident that there was nothing about their enemy they did not know. So this was too alien for them. They had no answer to tactics like this. Who even besieges their enemy from hundreds of kilometers away? The insane part was that it was working. The Ryugan soldiers stared at the distance, all of them lost. Even the captain found himself frozen at the parapet, utterly without recourse. No orders came to his lips. There were no orders to give. Another round of javelins slithered across the distance and ate into the wall sections and the gate. The gate itself absorbed the damage, shuddering but holding. The walls could not. Stone exploded outward in a spray of debris, and the ramparts shook so heavily that soldiers stumbled and grabbed for handholds. Even the gate was only a matter of time, or to be more accurate, a matter of volleys. The captain stood there, staring at the gate he had sworn to protect. It had barely been an hour since the attack started. The Empire had done nothing but throw their javelins from an impossible distance, and it looked like they were going to take the gate in just 1 hour. It would be utterly humiliating for them as a nation if the Empire took their gate in a single hour. The general had granted him the order to protect this gate even if it cost his life and to buy the Azure Heiress as much time as he could. But that was the problem. How much time could he afford at this moment? All he could do was stand and watch the city gate fall. The captain turned and stared at the vastly burned land to the north. There, the only hope. Whoever had thrown what destroyed the forest was their only solution, their only way out of this. The captain had heard of the strange person who had been crowned an archduke and given command of the nation's army, holding supremacy even over the general himself. That was what the rumors said, anyway. But the army's loyalty, especially the aerial squads, still lay with the general. Nothing could change that. Still, the rumors mentioned a very strong man, someone who had even defeated the Gentleman of Ash and Flame. Any captain knew how impossible it was to defeat the Gentleman of Ash and Flame. And yet, the captain, among many others, wanted to believe it was just exaggeration. But in a moment like this, especially with the devastation that he had just seen with his own eyes, he found himself wishing, hoping. He inhaled and exhaled heavily. Just in that moment, another round of javelins were flying toward them. But all of a sudden, there was another projectile from the northernmost corner where the arrow of light had flown. Something else pierced through the sky. There was a white one first, then there was a black one. They were blurry, and most soldiers could not see them. But the captain could. He would not be a captain if he couldn't see what others missed. He was a master after all. Both arched across the air and flew toward the wall with devastating speed. The first was like a white and gold blade made flesh, piercing through the wind with wings of light. The second was like a living shadow, something that felt wrong, something that should not exist. The white figure with their cloak flowing back created a stark contrast against the dark shape that flew ahead of them. Then the captain saw the white figure draw the string of their bow. The bow itself was strange, beautiful too. But the captain did not get the time to appreciate its beauty. A deafening sound resounded across the air and the arrow flew, clashing with the first javelin just before it crashed into the gate. The javelin flash froze. Its momentum died instantly, and it dropped to the ground like a dead bird. The archer had not only released another arrow before the captain looked up. He had released 5 more in barely a moment. 5 arrows flew, intercepting the javelins and freezing them instantly. Frozen spears fell from the sky like hail. He was already shooting more. The white creature flying ahead of him had gone far forward, raising a spear of light and clashing with the javelins that would have destroyed the walls. Where the spear struck, javelins shattered into fragments of ice and metal. The captain stared. For the first time in an hour, he breathed. Chapter 1351, The Fourth Legion. Chapter 1351, The Fourth Legion. A black-haired man with sharp eyes and crow's feet etched deep into weathered skin walked at the head of a column of soldiers, all clad in black and red. Above them hung a dome that hid them from everything. They had passed several monsters on the march, and none had caught so much as a whiff of their presence. The dome did not merely render them invisible. It made them non-existent. Originally a simple artifact belonging to the 7th Legion's commander, his subordinate's talent had amplified its properties beyond recognition. The Empire's crafters had since produced replicas capable of achieving similar effects, though those were single-use items lasting only 24 hours. Kalik had done this too many times to count. Infiltrations against the monarch's armies, support operations for the excavation efforts in the eastern lands. That particular campaign was bleeding the Empire dry. Every attempt to establish a foothold on the eastern continent carved a deeper wound into imperial resources, which was precisely why this conquest mattered. The Empire needed to grow, needed fresh territory, fresh blood, fresh strength to project against the denizens of the East. Having participated in that expedition himself, Kalik understood the math with painful clarity. Numbers meant nothing against Easterners. Their individual strength was astronomical and unreasonable. The empire needed quality, not quantity, and that meant expanding its pool of talent. Which was why he intended to see this conquest succeed personally. It should be simple enough. Enter through the back while the main force drew attention to the front. Infiltrate the palace. The aerial forces this little nation possessed would scramble to cover the distance the 7th Legion had created, leaving their rear exposed. Even if they held something in reserve for an ambush, it would prove useless. They were the 4th Legion, after all. The Empire maintained 5 essential arms of military power. The legions ranked lowest among them, 9 in total, arranged in strict hierarchy. The 4th and 7th had been called to this conquest, and while the 7th held respectable strength, the 4th stood as the Empire's most formidable ground force. Of course, back home they were still considered little more than a mob compared to the higher arms. Kalik remembered encounters with members and captains of those superior forces. The way their presence alone made him feel small, insignificant. He had volunteered for the Eastern Expedition hoping it would earn him promotion into those ranks, preferably one of the first 3 arms. Instead, he'd been elevated to Legion Captain, 6 steps above common soldier. He was grateful for it, but he wanted more. "Captain Kalik, sir." The voice came from his right. "Isn't that fog getting more suspicious?" Kalik turned to regard the young man beside him. Hassan, his direct assistant, with red hair that faded to black toward the tips, cut in uneven layers. Then Kalik looked forward. They had encountered multiple monsters on their approach, engaging none of them thanks to the dome. But the further they traveled, the fewer creatures they'd seen. That absence nagged at him. It would not have seemed strange to anyone else. But Kalik had raided rifts, had fought field monsters across 3 continents. Monsters were territorial by nature. The fact that different species had congregated in one area only to vanish entirely as they approached this particular stretch of forest. He had suspected something was wrong before Hassan spoke. The young man's words merely confirmed it. Kalik raised his fist. The entire column stopped as one. Behind him, the hooves of their hell horses swept to stillness against the forest soil, the sound swallowed by the dome's influence. They were close now, close enough to see the fog clearly. It covered the forest before them like a wall of darkness that surpassed even the moonless night. Not mist, not natural vapor, something else entirely. Kalik studied it with half-lidded eyes. Concerning. Behind them, the soldiers followed his gaze to the wall of blackness. Chuckles rippled through the ranks. To them, this was merely another obstacle for their captain to dispatch. Another story to tell over drinks. In Kalik they trusted. At his side, Hassan studied the dark fog with more caution, jet-black eyes cataloging every detail worth noting. "Could it be another monster?" he asked. "Something that spread its domain and drove the others away?" "Most likely." Kalik nodded slowly, still watching the fog. "And something tells me our dome will be useless once we're inside." He paused, considering. If this is truly a manifested domain of some kind, it won't be simple to eradicate. Expect it to be a behemoth. Hassan nearly fell from his saddle. "Behemoth? Captain, that should be impossible." "Indeed, it should be." Kalik's voice remained flat. "We received no intelligence suggesting anything of this magnitude. But we cannot conclude until we confirm." Hassan's expression had gone pale. "Shouldn't we send word back to Lord Pyrrhus?" Kalik closed his eyes and opened them. Then he raised his head to the dark sky, and a cold smile curved his lips. "There'll be no need for that." Hassan turned to read his captain's face, confusion plain on his features. Kalik's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Soldiers, defense formation, Falcon's Wing." Hassan abandoned his questions. His hand swept to his back and brought out a long, conical shield in one fluid motion. His legs clamped against his horse's flanks, directing the beast into position. Around him, the column responded with practiced precision. Hell horses neighing as they wheeled into formation. The line folded into itself with flawless cohesion, shields rising in unison, spreading across the landscape like a pair of wings preparing for flight. The formation locked into place. The shields shimmered. Red light erupted from their surfaces, forming a canopy of protective energy above the column. In that same instant, something massive fell from the sky. A black rod, impossibly large, struck the canopy dead center. The shield didn't crack. It simply ceased to exist, shattering into smithereens like glass meeting a hammer. The formation beneath it fared no better. Soldiers and hell horses alike were hurled into the air, ragdolled by force that seemed to mock gravity itself. Cold wind exploded from the point of impact. It became a blizzard in the space of a heartbeat, ice and darkness howling outward in every direction. Shadows pooled across the forest floor, spreading like spilled ink, and from those shadows came spikes, black, sharp and growing. They stabbed upward into horses and men alike. A grotesque tree of darkness, spreading its branches through flesh and bone. Chapter 1352 When a demon wants you to live, only then can you evade death. Chapter 1352 When a demon wants you to live, only then can you evade death. The night had become something else entirely, swallowed by a dreadful white fog that seemed to grow invisible teeth and bite deep into the body. And as if that were not enough, vicious things grew from the shadows and slaughtered tens before anyone could so much as scream. In the span of a heartbeat, Colic felt total control of his army slip through his fingers. The formation that should have held against any weight shattered instantly. The dome meant to hide their location proved useless. But that wasn't even the main problem. The main problem was the identity of whatever was attacking them. It was unknown. Ryugen had turned the Empire's own tactic against them. After all, the Empire had attacked the vanguard of that little country with precisely this intention, to exploit the primal fear of the unknown. Captain Colic was not a votary of mind games. He loved to dive in with superior strength and take his victory by a forceful hand. He loved enemies that put up great fights. Being on the receiving end of such a tactic, he couldn't help but admire its brutal effect. The sudden snow slowed the soldiers' movement and separated them from each other. From everything. Each passing second they spent within it was dreadful. Colic had reinforced his body with essence and wasn't shivering from the cold. But many soldiers were already dropping dead from frostbite. And there were still the spikes to contend with, the ones growing out of the pool of darkness that now covered the ground. It was a dilemma, but Colic was smiling. As another spike lunged toward him, he brought his shield down with both arms and slammed it onto the spike before it reached him. The thing was durable. Took a moment, but Colic figured out that all he had to do was use his weight. Soon he was crushing the strange, solidified darkness, grinding it into wisps of black smoke. "Calm down, you brutes. It's just hard, not indestructible." His voice carried across the blizzard. Whether any of his subordinates actually heard him was another matter. The snow had veiled every single one of them from each other. The spikes came again. Colic was alert. He swung his shield back casually, letting a shadow spike crash against it, but several more flew toward him from all directions. He twirled, gathering momentum, and the cold wind around him whirled with him. Using that momentum, he disrupted the spikes. His limbs shot out in quick succession, blurry with speed. In less than a moment, all the spikes scattered into fragments that vanished into wisps of black smoke. As if that weren't enough, hundreds more appeared. There was no end to them, all of them descended upon Colic. In that moment his breath went cold. His gaze sharpened. Then he disappeared, leaving only a fluttering of black petals that drifted in the frigid wind. The spikes crashed into each other, hooked into each other. Immediately, Colic reappeared with another round of black petals scattering into the air. He stood atop the shadow spikes for a single breath before they dissolved into liquid form and sank into the ground. He landed gracefully where they had been. "Why don't you show yourself and get down to business? Are you scared of the overwhelming numbers? Want to even the field by being sneaky?" His lip curled. "I hate sneaky. Be bold." "I don't know which is more insulting." The voice was hoarse and cold. Came from everywhere and nowhere. "The fact that you think I'd want to be sneaky with the likes of you, or the fact that you actually dare call my shadow just hard?" Colic whipped his head around and found nothing. His brows furrowed. He was certain he had heard something just now. "Right here, you diminutive human." The shadows beneath his feet surged upward. Colic leaped away instantly, every instinct screaming. But even as he moved, he felt a hand touch his back very tenderly. All his senses flared. He snapped his hand sideways, reaching back to strike, but the hand caught his easily, held and twisted it. The snap of bone was sharp and clean. His arm bent at the wrong angle. His ankle twisted in a direction unbefitting to the eye. "Ah, I broke your arm. My mistake." The voice was right beside his ear now, quite casual. "Here, let me fix that." The white-haired man standing behind him snapped his arm back into place. It healed instantly. The pain disappeared before Colic had even begun to feel it. But there was a problem. The white-haired man behind him was also in front of him, standing where the shadow had been rising a moment before. He held a dark rod loosely in one hand. "What was that dreadful thing I felt just now?" Colic was certain he had felt an immense wave of dread, something that had made him flee before he could think when the shadows began to rise. But now it was gone, like it had never existed in the first place. "Why are there two of him?" He observed both figures cautiously while glancing around for subordinates who might have survived the perilous snow, especially now that the blizzard was clearing. The northern in front of him noticed his searching gaze and a flat smile crossed his face. "I don't think anyone is coming for your rescue." It's actually quite an obscene expectation you have of your soldiers. He laughed softly. The scenery was clearing. The darkness receded, and with it, the faint light of the moon finally pierced through. What? Kalik's eyes went wide. The ground of the forest was littered with bodies. His legion, every single one of them lay frozen and still, their faces locked in expressions of surprise or agony. All of them had frozen to death. Not a single one had survived. Not even Hassan. Cold fear settled deep in his chest as he turned back to the white-haired man, who was now smiling. The man shrugged casually. So you see, it's not that you were strong or smart. All that essence wrapped around your body is truly useless. His smile didn't waver. The only reason you're still alive is because I want you to be. Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today.